You found it. Your home for the best content on your favorite team, the Fighting Tigers of LSU. Do us a favor, subscribe to the channel, leave your comments below, and be sure to smash that like button. About a week ago, Bo Davis surprised most everybody in college football whenever he left LSU after one season to take the defensive line coaching job with the New Orleans Saints. Something we've talked about a good bit here. A guy that doesn't love the new world of college football and has made it known. And so he's leaving college football to go to the NFL. So with LSU here less than a week away from the start of spring practice, thinking they had their defensive line coach locked up with some stability, highest paid defensive line coach in the country, an LSU alum, all that stuff. Now all of a sudden very quickly going through a search. Over the weekend, Bruce Feldman reported that Gerald Chatman was the front runner for this job and ultimately declined and decided instead that he would be staying at the University of Florida. Now, Chapman's story is an interesting one because, if you remember, Chapman had been at LSU on two different occasions in his career. Once the final season under Ed Orgeron in 2021 when Brian Kelly came in. Obviously, he didn't retain that staff. And then Brian Kelly brought Gerald Chapman back to Baton Rouge. And interestingly, Chapman was the interim defensive line coach after Jamar Cain very abruptly left in the middle of spring ball to take a job with the Denver Broncos. And when it came time to make the full-time hire, they brought in Jimmy Lindsey and didn't offer the job to Chapman. Chapman went to Tulane for a year and then went to Florida, and now LSU circled back. So a couple of things about Chapman that are important to note here. Number one, Gerald Chapman's still a young coach. He's got 4 children, 7 and under. So you're talking about a guy that still has a young family and throughout his relatively young coaching career has never been at one place more than 2 years. So this is very likely a situation where two things are at play. Number one, stability matters some for his family. The other is money. Now, Gerald Chapman this year at Florida made just over $500,000. It was I'm looking for the exact number here. His salary was doggone it, I thought it was here. In any event, Chapman was making in the 5s at Florida and was in line for a slight raise at LSU, but as I understand it, one of the real sticking points here was his buyout. He had a buyout, as I was told today, over $300,000. And you might say, well, what's the big deal? Well, at some point you get sick of spending on buyouts. And especially in a time where revenue share is part of our reality, and you're looking at ways to increase revenue and decrease spending, putting that money on the ledger for a buyout for a coach can be problematic, especially as a defensive line coach, a position coach. Now, if it were a head coach, you're having a very different conversation. So I think that was part of this. All in all, over the weekend, Bruce Feldman announced that LSU and Gerald Chapman couldn't come to an agreement, so Chapman's going to stay at Florida. They'll give him a contract extension. He'll stay in Gainesville. So now LSU has to turn their attention elsewhere. And as I learned, we have a report today at LouisianaSports.net. There are a handful of candidates outside of Chapman that are sort of involved in these conversations. The front runner, as I understand it, as of today, is Al Davis. Now, not that Al Davis. Al Davis is currently the defensive line coach at Missouri. So this is one worth keeping an eye on. Davis is actually from Louisiana. He has ties to Blake Baker, Kevin Peoples, and also Jake Olson. All three of those LSU assistants were on staff at Missouri when Davis was there as well. Davis played collegiately at Arkansas, so a guy that played in the SEC, is coached in the SEC, and this year at Missouri made $430,000. He would be in line, obviously, for what would be a relatively significant raise from what he was making at Missouri to what LSU might be willing to pay. That is more fiscally responsible, we'll call it that. Al Davis, as I would say, is, as it was expressed to me by multiple people today, is very likely the front runner for this job. Now, the caveat that we always talk about with coaching hires is it is never done until it's done. Like contract sign, press release goes out, coaches at the podium doing the introductory press conference. I do think at this point Davis would be the leader in the clubhouse for this job, but there's a handful of other candidates that have also been mentioned. Randall Joyner is an interesting one. He is the Ole Miss defensive line coach presently. He's been there for 4 years, and he has coached some high-level defensive linemen there at Ole Miss. Sam Williams, Jared Ivey, Cedric Johnson, J.J. Pegues. He's done a good job at Ole Miss, sort of a top-of-the-game type guy. He made $750,000 this past year at Ole Miss, $725 actually to be exact. As I understand it, he's got a similar buyout situation to Gerald Chapman. So financially, this could be difficult to pull off because it would be a very expensive hire. Now, you might say, Matt, you just spent all that money on the roster. You're going to skimp on a D-line coach when you were paying Bo. Listen, I think part of it is you were willing to spend what you had to spend to get Bo Davis because there were so many people internally that wanted Bo Davis. Look, he had so many connections here. I mean, connections with Frank Wilson, with Verge Osbury, with so many former staff members, administrators, Scott Woodward, of course, boosters. Bo played here. Former players vouched for him. I mean, it was a thing where so many people wanted to make that happen to provide stability at that spot for a long time that it was justifiable. I think you have to reframe and say, okay, what are you actually willing to spend in the regular market, not when it's just Bo Davis, right? So I think that's where this might change a little bit. So I'd say Al Davis, Randall Joyner are two that have been contacted. Davis probably the front runner at this point. The others that that are interesting, worth keeping an eye on. Pat Hill is one. I had to clarify. I was like, I heard Pat Hill and I was like, Pat Hill, like the former Fresno coach? No. Pat Hill, who played for the Minnesota Vikings, actually is currently the assistant defensive line coach with the Minnesota Vikings. In Brian Kelly's first season in Baton Rouge, Pat Hill was a defensive analyst for LSU in that 2022 season. And then the last 2 seasons, he's been with the Minnesota Vikings as their assistant defensive line coach. There's an opportunity to bring someone with an NFL pedigree back to Baton Rouge. Brandon Dedrick is an interesting one. You probably recognize the name because Dedrick is a guy who played collegiately at Alabama, so a name that we're all familiar with from his time playing for the Crimson Tide. Since his NFL career ended, Dedrick went to Ole Miss, where he was a defensive analyst for 2 years in 2023 and 2024, and just this offseason was hired by Southern Miss as their defensive line coach. So he's presently the defensive line coach at Southern Miss, but has yet to coach a game or a practice there. But that's another one who apparently has had exploratory conversations. And the last name, as I understand it, is Travion Robertson, who's currently the defensive line coach at South Carolina, and boy, they've had a lot of success. So you can see some common threads here. Gerald Chapman, Al Davis, Randall Joyner, Pat Hill, Brandon Dedrick, Travion Robertson. Every guy I just mentioned has ties to the SEC, ties to LSU. So Brian Kelly is narrowing that search here with very specifically with ties to the SEC. But here's the thing. There's 2 things to consider. Number one is timeline. Now, the coaches are off right now with the Mardi Gras holiday, and they begin spring practice on Saturday. So I wouldn't anticipate any type of announcement until at least Wednesday, right? You get past Mardi Gras. Wednesday would stand to be the reason where you'd make an announcement, or later in the week where you might hear something more. But Wednesday, probably, I don't think you'd hear anything before Wednesday, which would seem to make sense for that timeline with today and then tomorrow being Mardi Gras. The other thing is when you're making this hire, I think there's a very real consideration that you have to have, which is how much does recruiting matter? There was a time when you had coaches on staff that the primary reason they were on staff, not the only reason, but the primary reason they were on staff was recruiting. Like, for example, when Frank Wilson left to become a head coach in 2017, no, it had to be earlier than that, because it was Les Miles. Les hired Jabbar Jalouk as his running backs coach. Had to be 2015, I guess, as his running backs coach. Well, this is non-debatable. You have to have someone on LSU staff at all times with ties to New Orleans. That is too important a recruiting ground. You have to have someone with deep ties to New Orleans. I'm not saying it's the only reason Jabbar Jalouk is a coach. I mean, he's doing great now. I mean, he went to ULL with Napier. He's now at Florida with Napier. He's doing really well. But at the time, you hired a high school coach because you had to have ties in New Orleans. It's just an example, right? My point is now, I don't know how critical having a recruiter on staff is anymore. I mean, Bo Davis was a great example of that. I mean, Coach Pete Jenkins was here last week and shared with us the story that I know we talked about, but he shared about how when Bo Davis came to LSU, kind of had LSU lined up with Simeon Barrow and Dominic Williams, 2 transfers. You know, and he worked hard, recruited them hard. They were ready to come, and then it just came down to LSU got outbid, and so they went somewhere else, and that can be jarring. Like, look at Jakeem Stewart, Bryce Underwood. Like, you can be the best recruiter on the planet, but for some guys, it's just going to be a bottom line, binary conversation, as Terrio would say, a digital conversation. But so I really think that's part of it. I'd almost prefer saying, okay, who's going to be the guy that you can bring in that is immediately going to help mold and develop the talent you've brought in? Because you brought in talent. You've got Jacoby and Guillory coming off of injury. You got guys like Ahmad Bro and Don McKinley moving up to their sophomore seasons this year. You brought in Sadir Mitchell from the University of Texas. I mean, you have you have 4 young freshmen that you're bringing in this class. You got some talent and numbers and depth, but they're going to be developed. So I'm more concerned with this defensive line coaching hire to say, okay, who's going to develop this defensive line talent this year, less than I am who can recruit defensive line talent. Because if you need to, you can always go into the portal and you can buy it. That's just the reality. The sooner you accept it, that's just what it is. So get guys who can develop this talent. But as it stands, as I understand it, Al Davis from Missouri seems to be the front runner. How would Eli Drinkwitz just lose his mind? I mean, Blake Baker, Kevin Peoples, Jake Olson, and now possibly Al Davis as well. It's like LSU's just pillaging the Missouri defensive staff. But we'll see how that all develops. But just some names that I've heard and want to pass along to you. We'll keep an eye on as it develops. And when something comes of all this, we'll certainly talk about it here. Hey, thanks so much for watching. Please leave your comments. I love to interact. And be sure to hit the red subscribe button below.